Dr. Stephen Hegedus is the Dean of Education at Southern Connecticut State University, with previous appointments as full professor of mathematics and mathematics education at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, and research fellow and lecturer at the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom.
He is also the founding director of the Caput Center for Research and Innovation in STEM Education. His PhD in mathematics education was from the University of Southampton, also in the United Kingdom.
He is the principal investigator and co-principal investigator of various NSF-funded and U.S. Department of Education-funded projects. His present work is in the development and study of dynamic software environments with associated curriculum focusing on classroom connectivity and haptic force feedback technology. This work also involves the professional development of pre- and in-service teachers and large-scale integration of innovative technologies into K-12 curriculum.
Dr. Hegedus has also directed a mathematics and science partnership in Massachusetts, improving teacher content knowledge and growth within an entire district of grade 4th through 8th teachers.
Research interests also include semiotics, specifically the coevolution of symbolic, thinking, and digital technologies, and the role of metacognition in advanced mathematical thinking.
He has also published and presented numerous papers and workshops at local, national, and international venues. He is associate editor of several journals and has co-supervised 7 doctoral students and 8 master's dissertations to successful completion. We will want to remind you to please hold your questions until the end of each section for his presentation, and that there will be a reception following. Thank you.
Thank you. They deserve a round of applause. Welcome. Good evening. Hear me at the back? Good? Great. Welcome to Southern, and I still find that funny to say after being here now for 7 months, but for me it's an exciting time. It's almost the end of the semester, so I thank the faculty and the students from Southern who are here tonight as well, and for all of our guests, welcome. And this is an exciting innovation that the newly formed Student Leadership Group in the School of Education wish to initiate to help students meet other students, students to meet faculty, and our partners and colleagues in the school system locally as well. So there may well be some teachers or principals here tonight, which will be exciting. So the fun piece is after, right? So I'll keep the talk low. The fun piece is the networking, and please, if you can, join us afterwards in Con Hall seminar room, just over the bridge. There's a good spread on for you all for getting through my talk tonight. So you're all here because you want to know the answer to this question, right? Or you want to know what the question means. What's the relevance of the year? So hopefully I can get there. But a lot of what I will be talking to you about tonight stems from about 15 years of research. So I thank the National Science Foundation and the Institute of Education Sciences as well for helping support that continuously over a long period of time. So my talk is in 4 sections, where I start by looking at posing the question around, do schools kill creativity? Then move on to a short description of a very influential report, the Robinson Report, led by Sir Ken Robinson in England in 1999. Seems a long time ago, but I want to refer to it because I'm posing that it's still relevant today, the findings and the suggestions in that commissioned report. Then I want to turn to my reflections on creativity and how we can establish a program before finally talking about some of the data, the research that my team at UMass have completed. And some of the articles that I will be referring to tonight are available, I believe, outside somewhere. I don't know where. On the table at the back. So there's only a few. So in the interest of saving paper, if they're gone and you wish to, for a copy of them, I'll be happy to send you them. So do schools really kill creativity? This is a quote from an interview with Sir Ken Robinson. One of the problems is that the organization of education in most countries is developed to meet the needs of an industrial economy, and that's simply not suited to the 21st century. We educate people in a very linear way. The whole assumption is based on a 1950s model whereby children have to be processed in an orderly fashion through the curriculum, eventually go to university, get a good degree, and then they'll get a job for life. Still has relevance today. For those of you who know me, I'm not a great fan of the word pipeline. We use it a lot. And it's again conjuring up this linear processing of our children and students, young adults, and all of us through a system that I'm not quite sure what the pipe is. And neither does this lad here. His name is Nico. He's one of mine. And he's my youngest at the age of 8. He just started a few months ago when we arrived in Connecticut. We were in Massachusetts for 15 years prior to coming to Southern. That's his school in Guilford. So, do you want to know my answer? But what's your answer? Yes? Who thinks yes? Show you, raise a hand. Okay, who thinks no? Who's scared to respond? I'm not sure what his world will look like in 5 years' time. And there are different dimensions and ways of looking at what his world is, or anyone else entering the school system. And in fact, will he even retire in 2075? So when I arrived in the United States, this was the equipment that I got. Remember those colorful Macs? And this is a typical reflection on how computational power has advanced and doubled every year since during that period of time. So with this kind of technology, many of it at-handedness, what world does Nico live in? The opportunities for him and his identity can be projected into that world. He can see things, and he does, and be part of things previously invisible. So I posit that he can position himself relative to this world. And in doing so, he defines himself, his creativity, and his education. Leave that there for a moment. It's purposely provocative. As I often say, as an academic and now as a dean, that's my job. So if you disagree, good. And hopefully we can engage in a dialogue about that. So now let me turn to the Robinson report that I referred to previously. This was a national advisory committee that the government established to look at creative and cultural education, led by Ken Robinson, now Sir Ken Robinson, who was a professor at the time in England. This report argues that no educational system can be world-class without valuing and integrating creativity in teaching and learning, in the curriculum, in the management and leadership, and without linking this to promoting knowledge and understanding of cultural change and diversity. The result of this report were many CEOs really were asking for change, calling for change. This can be thought of in terms of economic workforce development, but it was more than that, because the components of the report also looked at cultural change. So what are the challenges for education? Remember, this was 1999, 16 years ago? Thank you. I'm not very good at math. I'm not. The economic challenge. Arithmetic. The economic challenge, to develop in young people the skills, knowledge, and personal qualities they need for a world where work is undergoing rapid and long-term change. The personal challenge, to develop the unique capacities of all young people and to provide a basis on which they can each build lives that are purposeful and fulfilling. The social challenge, to provide forms of education that enable young people to engage positively and confidently with far-reaching processes of social and cultural change. So economic, personal, social, and then the technological challenge, to make their way with confidence in a world that is being shaped by technologies which are evolving more quickly than at any time in history. And we can continue to say that still today. Now, as an educational technologist, part of my talk will focus a lot on technology and technology-enhanced classrooms today. Even though this report seems to be focused on young students in school, my comments tonight are reflecting all students. And as someone who has been involved in education from the early grades through to graduate education at every level, I can say from my own personal experience that a lot of what I'm talking about is applicable to all learners. The technological challenge about being shaped by technology revolving, the comment that I want to pull from that report, I don't want to go into too much detail about the report tonight, but you can download it. Young people need more access to information and ideas. Again, accessing the world. They need ways of engaging with them, making connections, of seeing principles, and of relating them to their own experiences and an emerging sense of identity. That's the response to the technological challenge. So what is creativity? Okay. And this is something that has been discussed by various academics and others in a wide variety of settings. Creativity is obviously to do with producing something original, but there are different ways about what is involved and who is creative. So the sectoral definition states that creative arts are often contrasted with the sciences, which tend to be thought of as uncreative. Not my definition. It is equally fundamental, though these are ways of thinking. These are ways that people think about it. It's equally fundamental to advances in the sciences, in mathematics, technology, politics, business, and all areas of everyday life. There's the elite definition, which is something that only a few people have, and with unusual talents. There's a democratic definition of creativity, that all people are capable of creative achievement in some area, provided the conditions are right and they've acquired the relevant knowledge and skills. And the theme of fostering creativity draws from many ordinary abilities and skills rather than one special gift or talent. Thus, the development of many common capacities and sensitivities can help to foster creativity, curiosity, memory, awareness. Okay? I just wanted to give you a flavor of the different ways that people think about creativity. And the report states that in teaching for creativity, teachers should aim to encourage self-expression that is oriented towards a given task. And I think as a challenge for the educators in the room and those of you who are preparing to be involved in an educational profession, do you do this? Is this something you think about? Is this something you would like to do but don't have time to do? Okay. My definition is I believe it's an imaginative or an expressive activity fashioned so as to produce outcomes that are both original and of value to others. And I want to highlight that last part, because that's where my talk and my research has been focused on, of the value. Looking at those aspects of respect inside a classroom as well as outside a classroom, and how my work, my contributions, whether the activity is structured through a curriculum or informal, how my contributions are valued. I promised I would pause between sections, didn't I? Yeah. So if there's any, before I move on to the third part of the talk, are there any small questions at this stage that I can take? Okay. Leave the substantive questions to the end. Okay, let me now move to how this led to the establishment of a research program. Not that my research is focused on creativity as much as seeing it as a product of some of the work that I've been involved in that has been in mathematics classrooms, both looking carefully at student learning, but other aspects of motivation, engagement, participation, and what technology-enhanced classrooms can actually yield. So when we think about creativity, there are internal forms of expression. I'll talk a lot about expressivity and personal expression. There's something central. There's something about the self, and there's a lot of affective dimensions. There are also a lot of external forms of expressivity. One sees and refers to it often as an aesthetic dimension. Aspects of spirituality, religion can be thought of in terms of an external form of expressivity. And also using technology as an external form. So I'm going to challenge that a little later on. I'm not going to touch on those areas. I have talked and written about those in other places, in other venues. But there's certainly things that come to mind when we're talking about creativity, both an internal and an external form. But in summary, the central piece often is referred to as something unique. It's personal, it's mine, it's individual. Okay. My piece of art is deemed more impressive relative to someone else's piece of art or whatever the creative activity is. But there are also affective dimensions, internal dimensions, when it comes to this. Fear, enjoyment, will I be judged in some way? But also relief, fulfillment, happiness, passion. What has all this got to do with 2075, right? I think it's got everything to do. And I feel a lot of it has been removed from our discussion about education. When we're looking at the learner, I have developed a model to try and examine more of these affective dimensions when one is looking at the work that I produce relative to others. And there are various forms of identity, starting with the classical Kant ego, moving then, this is a concentric model to try and capture the various forms of identity, to something that's private to myself. I might be writing a journal, I might be documenting something, I might be thinking about something. So that's what I would call a very closed form of identity, to sharing it, but sharing it in a private manner, in a semi-closed space, to then more open, semi-open, feeling more comfortable in sharing at a group level, to finally what might be seen as a theoretical concept of complete open, free access, that everything I know, everyone else knows. So really we operate somewhere in between those middle three zones, I believe, in various forms of instruction. But what I think is more important is not the nature of whether I'm doing small group, personal work, homework, however we want to describe it, but what moves us across those zones of privacy. And again, it's about affect, the various forms of affect that I wish to outline. And a lot of this, there's a sort of classical literature around identity that focuses on private space and public space. Especially in the first affective dimension coming out of postmodern feminist literature. So we might have a private space as a place to explore creative tendencies. We don't feel comfortable to share them, but we need a well-defined space. Leave me alone, I'm in my room. But what I'm going to show you tonight is that in a technology-enhanced classroom, we can actually develop various types of space, closed, semi-closed, from working on my own, working with a partner, sharing things at a whole classroom level, and then internalizing that and using other people's thoughts. And so the spaces shift within a single activity. Intimacy is also an important factor. Am I in a safe environment? Like I just asked you the question, yay, nay, and who feels nervous? Am I safe in this environment? Is it okay to share my thoughts? So there's a lot based on trust, comfort, particularly in a mathematics classroom. There's a lot of studies done on anxiety and the fear behind whether I'll be right or wrong if I talk, the anxiety behind algebra, and I'll come back to algebra in a moment. That's a really important factor when we start to think about education. Language is critical, and it's important for us to look at that. And both in terms of one's own personal space and also in contributions to others. But there can be nonverbal. Part of looking at discourse closely is not just to look at the verbal aspects of how we choose to share things, but also the nonverbal communicative acts, such as gesture. And those can be inherently mathematical in my world, but you replace mathematical with your own field, or at least test it out whether it's relevant. And one can infuse it with personal identity, just seeing what I'm doing there. You weren't looking or hearing the words, but looking at my gestural space, one can say something about how I feel and the intimate relationship to what I'm trying to represent. And finally, there's an intentionality as an important dimension when we are choosing to be in a private or a more open space. So this is classic Bakhtin, who talks about how we borrow words so that we can mean to others. We can populate them with our own meanings and intentions so that we can signify our relationship, attitude, and identity with others. Okay? And I think it's very important as a sociocultural theorist to, I'm not looking at the individual independent of a society and a world all around me. And as we think about how we wish to be received in drawing attention, that intentionality is important. It can be externalized through various forms of expression and action. So these different affective dimensions are important. We can layer it on a learning environment and see how that happens, how that operates. Somewhere between the teacher, the educator, the lecturer in a traditional sage on the stage, as I am demonstrating now. I don't know if I'm the sage, but certainly the single lecturer who's presenting versus what has been coined the guide on the side in certain types of learning environments. Either way, that has to be, when we layer that model on, we need to look at the varying forms of pedagogy. And I will skip that question because I'm going to come back to it later on. So I'm proposing that creativity is not so much an it, but a form of expression. We need to look carefully at expressivity. It can intersect with technology in various places. What's happening? That's a bit too bright now. They won't be able to see the slides. That's it. That's good. The lights are bored with me. It intersects with technology through representational forces. That's what I'm going to demonstrate in a moment. And it's a process where it intersects with identity. And if we focus, I'm proposing, if we focus more on identity, that can impact learning and motivation. So identity is a critical theme that I see throughout these different ways of thinking about interaction. And before I move in, I think it's important also to look at the technology aspect to this. So these are all establishing the various flavors of a research program that I led. So we often hear about Gutenberg and revolutionizing literacy by the invention of the printing press. But it took nearly 400 more years later to see Koenig's flatbed cylinder press. And that was really the one that accelerated social and technological change. Okay, that was what allowed mass production of literature and to establish a broad literacy basis. And that has impacted social identity and knowledge. Why am I talking about that? It's a very important technology to look at, and the impact of that technology over several hundreds of years. So when we start talking about the role of technology in classrooms today, do we think about it in that context, in an evolutionary context? Not always. What can I get in my classroom? How am I going to get a smartboard installed, or interactive whiteboard, or I need a laptop? Are we thinking about the affordances of that technology from an evolutionary perspective and the potential for impact? What is the next generation of social change from where we're at today? Again, thinking, what's it going to look like in 2075? And Krug has talked a lot about this very interesting book on linking technological and cultural change. By the beginning of the 19th century, all the social apparatus was present for a mass shared language. So once that flatbed cylinder press technology was in place, literature could spread. It's sort of an infrastructure to periods of change, Renaissance periods, allowing broad changes, sweeping changes in certain societies. But there are also costs to that, okay, in terms of access. So those who have access to new forms of literacy may advance, and those who don't remain the same. A problem we still have in today's society. So these are the things that I think about in the complex world of education. The individual, one's identity, the dynamics of a social, the individual as a corporate entity, and how we guide and are guided by our collective self. So you can influence the way I think, and I can influence the way you think. Identity is not just about self-efficacy. That's an important aspect of it, but also how I identify myself and my contributions versus others. So these two last questions, I think, are huge questions, researchable questions, and questions to think about. How do we participate and represent our thinking to others? And how are we represented by and perceived of by others? It's one thing to produce something. It's another thing to actually have that contribution received. When I raise my hand in a learning context, and that's a very traditional form of bidding for the floor to receive participation, acknowledgement. How am I going to represent my work, and how are others going to perceive of my contributions? John Henry Klippinger, I'd recommend this book, A Crowd of One, talks a lot about this. I'm, in the interest of time, going to skip. This is just simply the book's cover. But skip to the end. Basically, he's proposing there's no such thing as the noble savage. We are a crowd of one. And that if we will live without interaction with others, our growth would be stunted and we would fail to evolve and develop. All of these slides will be available on a website sometime soon. And then Ken Robinson, who I mentioned at the start, who led that commission, has written a book. Well, he's written several books and given several talks, and he's one of the most popular downloaded TED Talks as well on this subject. His book, The Element, I would recommend as well. This I will read through. Being in their element takes people to beyond their ordinary experiences of enjoyment or happiness. We're not simply talking about laughter, good times, sunset, and parties. People are in their element. They connect with something fundamental to their sense of identity, purpose, well-being. Being there provides a sense of self-revelation, of defining who they really are and what they really meant to be doing with their lives. And his book is really a collection of cases, experiences, where people are told at a very young age that they were no good, that they weren't going to succeed because they weren't following a formal system, and that what they wanted to do or what skills or talents they exhibited didn't fit in, wasn't the norm. And they went on to be highly successful and influential people. It's a fascinating, real story. And all of them link back to this fundamental sense of the element. So in summary, creativity involves some forms of expression. I'm proposing, and you'll see in a moment through my own work, that technology doesn't just have to be an external thing, a tool, but something that can be used to help develop internal forms of thinking. And identity is an important theme in my work as well. So I'm going to, last part of my talk, show some of the work that I've done and the evidence from that focuses on student learning and motivation. Oh, skip. Basically, the slide said educating. It's educating for all. That's a philosophy that we should be focused on. Now, this was not just because I was in Massachusetts for 15 years, but Massachusetts always does so great, right? This is from the well-known TIM studies. There's still an achievement gap Actually, the achievement gap grows more in math and science for 8th graders. It's still there, it's still real between comparing white and black students. And it's actually, since the tests have begun, it's been the largest in 15 years. Whatever you think of the test, that is the reality that we face. So what are we in this problem for? There are 4 big problems that I see. There's the algebra problem, and a national report outlined this 15 years ago now. There's an issue around student motivation. There's the unfulfilled role of technology. I'm going to unpack these in a moment. And there's the problems for pre-K through 12 and higher education. End of the 19th century, barely 3% of the 18-year-old cohort were expected to graduate from high school. So less than 2% were expected to take some form of algebra. Now, 100 years later, it's necessary for all children to learn some algebra to graduate and to be prepared for college. Right? Now, there are other expectations, but that's real. And I understand, Dean Pavesa will help correct me here, there is a national shortage of nurses. And the NIH has tied it back to algebra. So they are focusing on this critical bottleneck that is not leading to success. Okay? This is my friend the shopkeeper arithmetic. What happens? We introduce algebra in high school. We do it abruptly. We do it in superficial ways. We do it in ways that are painful to students. It results, and this is real, to high school student failure, dropout, because it's done too late. So why don't we do it sooner, like the early grades? And there's a group of people looking at early algebra, what that looks like. And that doesn't mean taking Algebra 1 and teaching it in early grades, okay? It don't work in high school all the time. Why would it work in early grades? But it's how we have to start to think about how we represent these ideas, how we are using technology, and what does the learning context look like? Big issue we have that leads to a lot of high school dropout, especially in urban high schools, is student motivation and alienation. They don't feel of worth, they drop out. And when I was in Massachusetts, I remember where the MCAS there, 10th grade, is not only a standardized test, it's a high stakes test. If you don't pass that, you don't graduate from high school. Okay? And what we've seen, well, we've seen a lot of things, but to incentivize students that math and science is important in life. You've got to learn math and science. It doesn't work, though. Just telling a learner that they need to do it because it's important, because one day you'll need it, that doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. And there's a lot of literature in educational psychology that seems that extrinsic motivation, such as rewards, can have an undermining effect. If we're not doing it, we're not focused on intrinsic motivation, which reflects our need, our propensity, our will, our desire, our own personal desire to want to learn something for our own interest, then it's not going to work. And I've seen, again, looking and studying how curriculum and aspects of the strategies that are used to attend to some of these really big problems, is that they've been completely orthogonal. We'll have a curriculum and a curricular development and a focus and a sequence, and then we'll have all these other things to help them get through. We're not thinking about engagement and motivation from a curricular and a pedagogical perspective. And that's what I've worked on in trying to develop. But we know motivation is a huge issue. That's basically what I've just said. I'm going to skip ahead and get to the Larry Cuban, again, just over 10 years ago, and continues to talk about the unfulfilled role of technology. We now have it in schools and in universities and colleges, and national reports are saying it's there. It's not less of an issue on access now. It's getting better in universities as well. But when they have frequent access, these surveys have shown that they're used for very simple tasks, posting things on websites, using PowerPoints or a smartboard to demonstrate things, but not looking at the affordances of the interactivity and how that can develop and change instructional practice. So it's very basic things, very conceptual things. And the phrase that my colleague Luis Moreno from Simvastaff in Mexico and I talk and written about is that technology can be seen as a prosthetic sometimes, that teachers are doing the same old thing with the new technology. They're propping up old practices. They're not rethinking about their practice from the point of how the technology can transform it. Why use an iPad, and I do, just to watch movies? Okay? Think about all those other things that having a multi-touch interface can actually afford. So now it's not so much about access, though that still is an issue in certain places, but it's more so about high-quality professional development that uses technology. It's about shifting mindsets. And my philosophy there is that we need to think very carefully about putting the student back at the center of the classroom. Contentious slide number 2. Curriculum and assessment have dominated the classroom. These are, of course, extremely important aspects of education. But if we lose sight of that child, that learner, that student, and focus just on curriculum without thinking about all these affective dimensions and identity, then I don't think we're going to see much change. So the projects that I've led over several years resulted in software and curriculum, integrated software, curriculum, and professional development. Again, a lot of these things are often separated out. Someone will develop some software or hardware. Someone will think about the professional development that's needed. Some will write the curriculum. This was a team over multiple institutions over 10 plus years to go from basic to applied and eventually large-scale trials in Texas, Massachusetts, and various other countries. The focus of the environment are linking multiple representations, dynamic visualizations, having graphs that you can touch and drag rather than think about in a traditional symbolic format. We have that. There's the symbolic expression, but you can actually click and move, drag graphs around, and then at the top in the world, you can simulate it. And so this is an executable, dynamic representation that you can control. Not only can you do this on your own, but the classroom connectivity allows us, either through calculators or on computers, for me to send my contribution to a teacher, and for the teacher then to display everyone's work. So you will begin to see your work relative to others. Okay? So hopefully some of the more theoretical phrases now can have meaning in terms of relativism. One of the challenges we also have in traditional forms of mathematics instruction is that students tend to leave the classroom thinking that there's only one right answer. Okay? Now that's true for some certain mathematical problems, but not always. We can develop activities that allow multiple, various correct answers. We're not focusing on the correct, but more so on how my work is similar or different to others. And that's a big problem because it leads to the alienation, the lack of motivation. And again, I'm not the first one to say this in the United States, that it's okay to not be good at mathematics. Right? It's actually a really serious problem, the one I just mentioned. So here they can begin to create their own work locally, they can share it, they can work as groups, and to develop a wide variety of mathematical expressions in different forms. This is an old USA Today, but why do I bring this up? Why is mathematics relevant? Apparently I'm going to answer that next week in a talk at Gateway, but mathematical representations are everywhere. Look at the front page of newspapers today. You're most likely to see a mathematical representation, a graph, a jagged graph. And we're asking the average citizen to interpret, make sense of these, sometimes make decisions from them. You flip the papers, what do you have at the back, or in the back few pages? More representations, tables, multi-column tables, the sports pages. So they're everywhere. And sometimes these graphs can mislead. We use them a lot. What I find interesting, again, from my experience in Massachusetts, when I looked at a 10th grade MCAS, we would just have, the graphs would just be on regular accumulation graphs, like position time. I look on the biology MCAS, and there are rate graphs. Okay? Something is changing per minute against time. Those, and that comes up a lot in certain biological models, those are very difficult to make sense of for some students and for some adults. So I won't have time to demo, but one of the other forms of representation that belongs inside a mathematics environment is not just the regular forms, tables, symbols, graphs, but also narrative and storytelling. And so in building, these are pieces of graphs, just like the one you just saw in a national newspaper. In building graphs, some of our activities, some of our curriculum link that to narrating an exciting race, an exciting story. So in this case, the odd-looking fish, yes, that is a fish, up above is going to move depending on this blue graph, whereas the red fish is going to move along at a constant rate. And we ask students to think about an interesting story that can be pieced out for every segment of that graph. So again, we're looking to infuse their own personal identity, their own ways of thinking into a story that's linked to a mathematical function. And that has, given it's another representation, again, quite a powerful effect on expressivity and identity. Becomes something more about themselves that they can build versus something that they're giving to them in a textbook. And I mentioned before, looking then at their forms of gesture, their talk, their action, and we've seen lots of different forms of engagement. So in terms of in the empirical world, because we want to make claims, it takes many years to develop instruments. So the assessments that we have developed and validated look at not only learning, the content, the procedural and the conceptual skills, but also the attitudes. And simultaneously, we have measured the teachers' attitudes. We've actually used very similar surveys. So do we see changes in teachers' attitudes at time if we're seeing changes in students' attitudes? Are they connected in some way? We've also asked teachers not just SimCalc, our intervention, but also in our treatment versus our control classrooms where they're carrying on doing the regular instruction, to fill out logs. And I'll show you some very interesting data in a moment. When you ask, it's self-report data, but ask teachers over many months to record what they did in their classroom in a very simple bubble sheet, you start to accumulate huge amounts of data that is quite revealing. So our attitude survey that we built basically gets down to 4 constructs: positivity towards math and school, and there's a whole bunch of items there that we ask them on a regular basis. Working collaboratively versus working privately, that was a different construct. And then the role of technology. So these, through a factor analysis, became constructs that we wanted to look and see how do they correlate or not with changes in their learning. So we didn't separate out the two. Is there some link between how my attitudes, my levels of motivation or not, change and evolve over time? I don't expect you to interpret this chart, but basically it's a correlation matrix. And we started to see significant correlations between that. But in the comparison group, no. Okay, what about a high-achieving classroom? And high-achieving classroom, by that I mean on a test that we implemented in a repeated sense, and we looked for pre-post gains. We took one from each experimental group, the control and the classroom. We looked at the highest, one in the highest with the most gains. And there, again, but even more so, what I'm highlighting here, changes in attitudes in those 4 constructs, and changes in areas such as graphs, rate and proportion, using multiple representations. And we started to see all these correlations between shifts in attitudes and shifts in knowledge. But once again, for the highest achieving teacher, we saw no significant correlations at all. That started to reveal something that it's important to look at both aspects as well. Now when we turn to, well, what's going on inside the classroom? So we took those 2 studies because we were going in and videotaping these classrooms many times. So this graph is units of time, 26 classes. So over 2 months, we would go in and in a smaller scale study. And then we randomly looked at 10-minute chunks, and we simply counted the number of student-student turns to all student turns. What's a student-student turn? That's when a student speaks and then another student speaks. Okay? Count. And we kept doing that relative to all turns. Because, again, there's a body of work that really tries to encourage teachers not to follow the IRE sequence. And the IRE sequence, for those of you who don't know it, initiate, teacher asks a question, R, respond, student responds, E, evaluate, teacher speaks again. So that would be a teacher, student, teacher turn. And what we saw over time was that the student-student turns were increasing with a really interesting model, whereas in the comparison classrooms, they were pretty flat, around 10% of the time. And you might say, okay, well, that was just the students talking a lot, and the teacher wasn't, right? No. The teacher-student turns were almost identical for both classrooms. One of the things I did as a teacher educator, or in preparing teachers, is learn to not talk as much in classrooms. And it's interesting when we think about looking, as I had teachers look at tapes of their own practice, I would ask them how long do you pause? This is a really interesting question. When you ask a question, how long do you wait? And they'll go, 30, 40 seconds. And for faculty here, I'd ask the same question. How long do you think you pause, and how long do you pause for? And the real answer, on average, is about 2 to 3 seconds. Okay? So it's thinking about the time and the space in the classroom that are important, but the fostering of the student-student relationship without diminishing the importance and the role of the teacher was something that was very revealing. And then when we moved to a randomized study in Algebra 2 classrooms, these are basically the gains across, we disaggregated across all classrooms, the control group in the light blue and the treatment in the dark blue. And this is a tragic story in that there was, if you think I am actually scoring less on a test at the end of my 10th or 11th grade than I was at the start of the year, that's worrying. We don't want to see all blue, dark blue, because then you can say, oh, you just tailored a test towards a treatment group. It was one using a mixture of items from various national tests and standardized tests and some of our own open-ended tasks. And so you see a mixture. So students are learning, but more in our technology-enhanced classrooms. We also separated between what we call M1 and M2, the more procedural questions versus conceptual questions. Again, a criticism a lot of larger studies is that, well, you're doing the harder stuff at the expense of the procedurals. You're skipping over the skills and the procedures. No, we weren't at all. And we see gains in both those categories when we split them out. An interesting story we have, though, is the honors story. So the honors, when we look in the control classroom, pre to post, most of the learning that's going on are with the honors kids. But in ours, there's actually, it's more than 60-40. And that's a whole other paper. You know, what's going on there in that world, in the honors world, in schools? We see, again, significant gains when we look at socioeconomic status by using the 3 categories to disaggregate the data, those on free lunch, reduced lunch, and denied reduced lunch. By race and ethnicity, we have, you remember those sad, the bars going down? We actually see it in a community. And this gets back to, again, the source of alienation. I'm done. I'm not going to graduate from high school. I'm in this high stakes environment. I'm out of here. I'm actually going to not bother maybe at the end of the year. I mean, this is a complicated story. But in a classroom that promotes engagement, uses technology to enhance those forms of discussion, we see success. A closing of the gap, one might even hesitate to mention. And that, again, is by separated out by school district. And I forgot to mention that the districts that we worked with range from some of the lowest achieving, which happen to be urban context, to some of the highest achieving districts in Massachusetts. So what does, and I will conclude, what do, this is an example of a classroom to give you a sense of the intensity of the discussion. And as you watch this, it's a couple of minutes. I've played this video and done variations of this talk around the world. And it's interesting having, you can't do simultaneous translation of this video, as you'll see, but just to hear people's reactions to it, I'll be interested in what you have to say. But this is an average achieving school, and the students are arguing over 2 contributions that have been made. It's going to be a bit hard to see, but they've built, a pair has built 2 graphs. They're down in the corner, and they seem to be not fitting in with everyone else. They're sort of outliers. And so the discussion is about what the class thinks is going on. Okay? The people who contributed it are sort of keeping quiet on the side. You'll see why.